Well, while everyone else filters in, and since we're on a tight schedule, I thought I would go ahead and get us started with a brief introduction. This is our first Balanced Living lecture of 2014. We did a series of 4 last year, 3 of which are available on YouTube for those of you that don't know that. It's the Cincinnati Bar Association set up a YouTube channel. The Balanced Living lecture series is put on by the Health and Well-Being Committee of the Bar Association, which was started in response to a rising number of lawyers with depression and suicides, and seeks to help people live a balanced life and learn about taking care of themselves, because you're your most valuable resource as a lawyer. Today's program specifically is financially sponsored by the Cincinnati Bar Foundation and the Ken Jameson Health and Wellbeing Fund. Please remember the fund and the foundation in your yearly giving. Today's lecture is about sleep. I'm sure many of you here are, like myself, don't feel like you ever get enough, or sleep is something that you cannot seem to master, even though you master a lot of other things in your daily life. Today's speaker is Dr. Corser. He is from the Sleep Management Institute, is that correct? Here in Cincinnati, and he has put together a lecture, and we'll have some questions for you, question time for you after he's done. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, and we'll try to get a microphone to you so everybody can benefit from the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me today. So we're going to talk about sleep. So to start with, I'll have to tell you I've got a newfound appreciation for attorneys since my son is now a second-year law student in Emory. So if anybody's hiring in a couple years, give me a call. So let's talk about sleep. This is an overview. We're going to talk about what is sleep, what happens when we sleep, why do we sleep, changes in sleep that occur with aging, effects of sleep deprivation, and a couple abnormal sleep disorders, obstructive sleep apnea and insomnia. So sleep is a physical and mental resting state during which there's reduced sensory awareness in the environment and absence of voluntary movements. So there's been some interesting experiments that have been done where they've taken sleep-deprived individuals, propped open their eyes, and showed them visual stimuli. And the instant somebody falls asleep, that visual stimuli is not processed by the brain. So the brain decreases its sensory input, or its perception of sensory input, the instant we go to sleep. So sleep is essential for life. It's an essential component of good health. So the 3 pillars of good health: diet, exercise, and sleep. So really, to achieve good health, you have to have all 3 of these things. So sleep serves a number of functions. It serves to restore and recover our body and our brains. It serves to store energy. Our metabolism drops 10% below basal rate when we're sleeping. It also has a very critically important function in memory consolidation. In fact, sleep-deprived individuals have greatly impaired abilities to consolidate short-term to long-term memories. There's been a large body of research demonstrating this in recent years. Thermoregulation, our body temperatures drop while we're sleeping, and then finally homeostasis, meaning equilibrium. So a few months ago, there was an interesting study published in the journal Science, which really gave us a very new insight into the function of sleep. So this research was performed at the University of Rochester. So what they looked at was mice, sleeping mice, anesthetized mice, and awake mice, and they studied their brains during these conditions. So it turns out that during sleep, these little pores or vacuoles in the brain greatly expand while mice are asleep. What this allows is the cerebrospinal fluid to circulate through these vacuoles and wash away these toxic metabolites that develop during the course of the day. So this is a very new and interesting insight as to one of the main functions of sleep. It may be to help remove some of the toxic byproducts that develop during the course of our wakefulness. So this is a whole new insight into the function of sleep. So sleep occurs throughout the animal kingdom. virtually all animals exhibit some sort of sleeping behavior, even fruit flies. So it's interesting that aquatic mammals sleep with half their brain at a time. So this is called unihemispheric sleep. So now why does this occur? It occurs because aquatic mammals have to go to the surface to breathe. And if they don't do that, they die. So they have to have part of their brain awake at all times. So they alternate. The right side of their brain sleeps for a couple hours, and they alternate. The left side of the brain sleeps a couple hours. Migratory geese do the same thing. That's why they can continue to fly for extended periods of time. So this is true of all aquatic mammals. So how much sleep do human beings need? Well, here's a depiction of what mammals need. You'll see the little brown blats require about 20 hours of sleep in a 24-hour day. Giraffes, on the other hand, require 1.9 hours. Human beings are in the middle. We require about 8 hours of night to function at an optimal level. So sleep is required for survival. You know, so in sleep deprivation experiments done on rats, complete sleep deprivation is universally fatal for rats after 2 to 3 weeks. So if you deprive a rat of sleep for 2 to 3 weeks, their immune system collapses and they die. So this is universally fatal. So rats with sleep debt live about 5 months compared to the normal 2 to 3 year lifespan. So humans deprived of sleep can become paranoid and hallucinogenic. So this is Randy Gardner. So back in 1964, Randy Gardner, the 17-year-old who lived in San Diego, decided he wanted to set the world record for staying awake. So he stayed awake. This is without stimulants, by the way. This is completely on his own. So he stayed awake for 264 hours. He was closely monitored during this time, and during this time of sleep deprivation, he developed moodiness, problems with concentration and short-term memory, paranoia, and hallucinations. But after recovery sleep, he returned to normal. But it was interesting that he did this. So as human beings, we're diurnal, meaning that we have evolved to sleep at night and stay awake during the day. And our brain is very active during this time. There's a lot of different biochemical processes that occur in sleep that are very different that occur in wakefulness. So sleep is regulated by two primary processes. One is called the homeostatic process, and this simply means that the longer we're awake, the sleepier we become. Now the reason for that is that we have this accumulation of this metabolic product called adenosine in our brain. So the more adenosine we accumulate, the sleepier we become. And the longer we're awake, the more adenosine we accumulate. So caffeine works because it's an adenosine receptor blocker. So it blocks the effect of this adenosine in our brain, thereby allowing us to be awake. So anyway, so this is the homeostatic process of sleep. So the longer we're awake, the more sleepy we become. Now, if you have chronic partial sleep deprivation, you accumulate what's called sleep debt. So if your body requires 7 hours of sleep and you're only getting 6 hours a night of sleep, then you've accumulated an hour of sleep debt. And that sleep debt is progressive, and it can cause progressive impairment with every succeeding day that you don't achieve an adequate amount of sleep. So that's called sleep debt. So the other process regulating how we feel during the day is the circadian process. So we've got this clock in our brain that sends out an alerting signal. This clock in the brain typically keeps us awake for about 16 hours, and then it shuts off at night, allowing us to sleep. So these are two opposing processes that affect our degree of wakefulness. So the clock in our brain is set by light cues. So the Earth rotates on its axis about every 24 hours. And in this process, we're exposed to various degrees of light and darkness. So these light cues hit our eyes and set this clock in our brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This little cluster of cells in the brain is the internal timekeeper. Now this clock in the brain has a periodicity of about 23.9 hours. So there have been some interesting experiments whereby normal individuals have been taken and put into temporal isolation in a dim light. And over time, what happens is because our internal clock doesn't completely agree with a 24-hour cycle, these individuals become misaligned. So they will become totally out of sync with the rest of the world because their internal clock, and all of our internal clocks, are slightly misaligned with a 24-hour cycle. So light cues are what set the clock in our brain. So these light cues, by hitting the suprachiasmatic nucleus in our brain, cause cells in our body to produce proteins. These proteins accumulate during the course of the day and eventually feed back and suppress the genes that produce the proteins. So it's a feedback loop that causes our degree of wakefulness and sleepiness over a 24-hour cycle. Now, the reason this is important is because this clock in our brain sets our biorhythms. So an illustration of this is the fact that there's a couple hormones, there's actually a number of hormones that are tightly linked with sleep. One of these is melatonin. So our body produces melatonin about an hour before our usual bedtime. We get this surge of melatonin produced by our brain. Melatonin is the so-called hormone of darkness. It promotes and facilitates sleep. So we get this surge of melatonin about an hour before our usual bedtime, and that allows us to sleep. Conversely, there's a hormone called cortisol. That's the so-called stress hormone. Now, about an hour before we usually awaken in the morning, our body produces a surge of cortisol, and that allows us to wake up in the morning. So these biorhythms are all set by this clock in our brain. So these are the biologic clock. The master clock is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and the pineal gland is the gland in our brain that secretes melatonin. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus sits in the most primitive part of the brain, near the hypothalamus. And this, again, is set by light cues. This communicates with the pineal gland, which is the gland that produces melatonin, which allows us to fall asleep. So this is, again, an illustration of the melatonin level. So melatonin begins about an hour, production about an hour before we usually fall asleep. It remains elevated throughout the night. And then shortly before we awaken, it rapidly dissipates. And throughout the day, we have a negligible amount of melatonin in our bloodstream. So this is the two-process model of sleepiness. This regulates our degree of wakefulness during the day. So you see the sleep drive. That means the longer we're awake, the more adenosine accumulating in our brain, and the sleepier we become. When we go to sleep, this adenosine is discharged. It dissipates, and then in the morning we have very little adenosine in our brain. So opposing this is the circadian alerting signal. We have a high alerting signal, a relatively low alerting signal in the morning, but then as the day progresses, the alerting signal increases. Now there's two dips in the alerting signal during a 24-hour cycle. One is in the mid-afternoon. Between around 2 and 4 p.m. we have a dip in the alerting signal, and so we get a little drowsy in the mid-afternoon. Now, if you were to stay up continuously for 24 hours, the other dip you would see would be between 2 and 4 a.m. So that's the sleepiest periods during a 24-hour cycle, between 2 and 4 p.m. and 2 and 4 a.m. That's because of the dip in the alerting signal. So your brain is not inactive when you're sleeping. In fact, it's very active. So a lot of things happen during the course of sleep. Our body temperature drops. So normally during a 24-hour period, we have a fluctuation of about 1.5 degrees in our body temperature. Our body temperature starts dropping about an hour before we usually go to sleep, and it remains low relatively throughout the night and then increases during the day. So a lot of things happen during the course of the night while we're sleeping. Our blood pressure typically drops, usually by about 10 to 15%. Breathing rate decreases, heart rate decreases. So it's a time when our body is able to rest and restore itself. Now, when we monitor somebody in a sleep lab, we record brainwave activity. So the brainwave activity is very different when somebody is asleep as compared to wakefulness. In fact, we can calculate the second when somebody is awake versus when they're asleep based on the brainwave activity. So the top slide shows the sleep stage W, that means awake. And then you'll see drowsiness. Stage 1 is the lightest stage of sleep. Stage 2 is the intermediate stage of sleep. That's where we spend most of the night. Stage N3 is the deepest stage of sleep. The other name for that is slow wave sleep. So this is where growth hormone is produced. So then at the bottom you'll see stage R. That's REM sleep. That's where we have dreams. That's the dream state of sleep. So this is the so-called sleep architecture of a 20-year-old. So you'll see that we descend from stage wake into stage 1. We spend little time in stage 1. Then people descend into stage 2, and then typically fairly rapidly thereafter go into stage 3, the deepest stage of sleep. Now you'll notice that during the night, most of our deep sleep, in fact all of our deep sleep, occurs in the first third of the night. Now deep sleep is a stage of sleep where sleep walking, sleep talking occur typically. So if you've got a 5 or 6-year-old that sleep walks, you will see that they typically walk in the first third of the night. That occurs during deep sleep. After about 90 minutes, we enter into our first REM episode. That is the dream state of sleep. If we awaken people during a REM sleep episode, they will likely remember a vivid dream. If you, everybody dreams through the night, but unless you happen to awaken during a dream, you won't remember dreaming. Now, what you'll see here is that dreams lengthen as the night progresses. So most of our dreaming occurs in the latter third of the night. So if you want to remember a dream, you can set your alarm clock an hour before you ordinarily awaken, and you'll probably awaken during a dream. So this is the course of a typical night in a young, healthy person. So throughout our life, we spend about 2/3 of our time awake. And during sleep, about 80% is non-REM sleep and 20% is dream sleep. So how much sleep do we need? So newborns need a lot of sleep. And as we age, our sleep requirements decrease. Adults typically require 7 to 9 hours nightly. Now, teenagers require 8.5 to about 9.5 hours. So teenagers typically have a greater sleep requirement than adults. So there's a lot of massively deprived teenagers in high school and in college. So what happens as we get older? So typically what happens is we have less and less deep sleep with every passing decade. So that's the thing that is most affected with age, is we have less and less deep sleep. The other thing that happens is we have more and more light sleep as we get older, and we tend to awaken a lot more during the night with every passing decade of life. REM sleep, or dream sleep, is relatively preserved throughout one's life. So here's what happens through the night. At the top, you'll see children sleeping. They go to sleep and they don't awake through the night. They sleep straight through, sleep like a rock. As we get older, we tend to have much more interrupted sleep. We tend to awaken a lot more. We have less deep sleep. Dream sleep, again, is relatively preserved. So now an older adult requires about the same amount of sleep as a younger person, but that's why older people become drowsy during the day and take naps, is because their sleep at night is so interrupted. So to reiterate, the deepest non-REM sleep, stage 3, is frequently reduced or non-existent in older folks, but REM sleep is preserved, and there's many more awakenings during the night. So the number of hours that a person needs to sleep is determined subjectively. So the best way to determine your sleep requirement is, when you're on vacation, sleep without an alarm clock and see what you require, what your body requires. A person's optimal sleep time is that time that allows him or her to maintain good alertness throughout the day. And most people need 7 to 8 hours. So there are people that are larks. There are also people that are owls. And a lot of us, most of us, are in between. So this is, it was one study that demonstrated that about 25% of the population, this is working age people, are larks. That is, they're morning people. They wake up and they feel energetic and alert in the morning. These people tend to have higher oral temperatures in the morning. The body temperature is higher in the morning. Evening types have a higher peak temperature in the evening. So there's about 25% of the working age population is owls, 25% are larks. So it turns out that workers aged 30 to 34 were more likely to be definitely evening type and less likely to be morning type compared to those aged 45 to 49. There was one study that showed evening types are more likely to have higher intelligence scores than morning types. That could be subject to debate, but that's what at least one study showed. So, so most of us are neither larks or owls. We're somewhere in the middle. And this is really determined mostly by hereditary factors. In fact, there's specific genes that have been identified with being owls or being larks. So what is the consequence of sleep loss? So let's say your body needs 8 hours a night and you're only getting 6 hours a night. So what happens is alertness and vigilance become unstable and unreliable. Cognitive slowing occurs, increasing number of errors occurs. Task may be begun well but not completed properly. There's growing neglect of activities. Involuntary sleep attacks occur, and there's an increased risk for accidents and crashes, automobile crashes. So this is a study of sleep loss on performance. So this is called the PVT test. So this is a test of vigilance. So what this test is healthy young individuals were put in front of a computer screen, and at random intervals a flashing light was displayed, and the individuals had to press a computer key when they saw the flashing light. So you'll see in this study that this is a complete sleep deprivation study. So people were asleep here, they were awake here, and then this is complete sleep deprivation day 1 and day 2. So you can see that the number of errors increased dramatically, especially on the second night of sleep deprivation here. So this is a similar study over a more prolonged period of time. This is 88 hours of total sleep deprivation. And you'll see not only were there errors of omission, but there were errors of commission. In other words, false responses. So instead of hitting the keyboard appropriately when a flashing light occurred, people were hitting it inappropriately when there was no flashing light. So errors of omission and commission increased dramatically with increasing degrees of sleep deprivation. So this is a study of partial sleep deprivation, and this has been well validated in many different studies. So here's at the bottom here you'll see individuals sleeping 8 hours per night in bed, and then you'll see 6 hours night in bed, 4 hours of night in bed, and then total sleep deprivation. So you'll see that with partial sleep deprivation, over the course of 2 weeks, people became profoundly impaired in their ability to perform this simple task. So this is an illustration of the concept of sleep debt. As sleep debt accumulates, we become progressively more impaired over time to the point where at the end of 2 weeks, these people with 4 and 6 hours sleep per night were similar to the performance of somebody with severe narcolepsy or severe sleep apnea. So sleep deprivation, partial sleep deprivation, can have profoundly negative effects on our ability to perform. So the interesting thing about this is that there's a huge gap between objective performance and subjective assessment of people's ability to perform. In other words, people, even though they were profoundly impaired, didn't realize they were impaired. And this, again, has been shown in a number of different studies, that even if people are very, very drowsy, they don't perceive that they're impaired, or they don't perceive that they have difficulty performing a task. So there's been a lot of studies that have looked at effective sleep deprivation on physicians' ability to function. And this is just a list of some of the studies. You know, surgeons have more difficulty performing tasks. There's a lot of impairment in cognitive function. There's an increased number of errors in hospitals and physicians' ability to make diagnoses. So if you get sick, don't go in the hospital in the middle of the night. You know, wait till the morning if you can. So yeah, a lot of problems with sleep deprivation. So in 2012, there was a study of professions that get the least and most amount of sleep. This was commissioned by a mattress factory or a company, and based on a survey done by the National Center for Health Statistics. So professions obtaining least amount of sleep. Number 2, attorneys. Number 2. Physicians aren't far behind at number 4. So what about the most amount of sleep? Anybody want to guess? Who gets the most sleep? If you want to get the most sleep, be a lumberjack. Logging workers get the most amount of sleep, so be a lumberjack. So there's a lot of studies showing how sleepy workers are not very efficient. So 85% of office workers say they could be more productive if they slept more. About half of office workers say they don't consistently get a good night's sleep. So this has profound effects on people's ability to be efficient and perform at their optimal level. It's estimated that sleep deprivation costs U.S. businesses about $100 billion a year. So in recent years, there's been increasing studies showing that sleep deprivation is similar to its effect on performance as compared to consumption of alcohol. So after 18 hours of continual wakefulness, people's performance is similar to that of people with a blood alcohol level of 0.05%. Now, if you stay awake for 24 hours continuously, your performance is about that of somebody who was legally intoxicated. So a majority of police officers surveyed report having stopped a driver that they thought was under the influence of alcohol, only to find that the driver was simply sleepy. So there's a large body of evidence showing that traffic accidents are, in many cases, related to driver drowsiness or fatigue. In fact, 100,000 accidents per year are attributed to this. These crashes result in about 1,500 deaths per year and about $12.5 billion in monetary losses. And contrary to popular belief, elderly are at lower risk for sleep-related accidents than young people. So 60% of sleep-related crashes are caused by drivers less than age 30. And analysis of greater than 4,000 crashes showed that drivers less than 25 years were involved in 55% of these sleep-related crashes, and men are involved in more crashes than women. So when you're driving down the highway, you may want to look at the trucker who's driving the 18-wheeler next to you. So about 5% of truckers have severe sleep apnea. 15% of truckers are chronically or severely sleep deprived. So recently the DOT, Department of Transportation, has really been screening a lot of truckers for sleep apnea. So that's been a major initiative over the past year. So I'm seeing a lot of sleepy truckers in the sleep lab. So most of the driving-related crashes occur when we have a decrease in the alerting signal, a circadian alerting signal. So they occur in the in the middle of the night or in the mid-afternoon. So again, that's when most of these sleep deprivation accidents occur, early to mid-afternoon or early morning hours. So you only have to be asleep, have a micro-sleep for a couple seconds when you're driving down the highway at 60 miles an hour to completely move into a different lane. So if you've got a 4-degree drift, which is just a modest amount of drift, it only takes you 2 seconds at 60 miles an hour to be in a completely different lane. So this is Maggie Macdonald. She was a 20-year-old woman in New Jersey. In 1997, she was helping a coworker when she drove to work at 11:30 in the morning. She was struck and killed by a massively sleep-deprived driver. He had been up for 30 hours smoking crack cocaine. He was not under the influence of drugs at the time of the crash. Yet because there was no specific law addressing fatigue or drowsy driving in New Jersey at the time, the jury was not allowed to deliberate on the man's sleep deprivation, and his punishment was suspended jail sentence and a $200 fine. Her mother lobbied the state legislature and successfully enacted Maggie's Law, So this is the only state in the country that has such a law. So this law states that being awake for more than 24 hours and causing a fatal crash in New Jersey can result in up to 10 years in prison and a $100,000 fine. So yeah, it's interesting. This is the only state in the union that has enacted such a law. So warning signs of drowsy driving, trouble keeping your eyes open. So it turns out that you know, if your rate of blinking slows, that's probably the single best measure of fatigue behind the wheel. So if you start, you know, getting drowsy, or you tend to blink, the speed with which you blink becomes diminished, and that's a good indicator of drowsiness. Trouble keeping your head up, daydreaming, drifting across lanes, missing signs or exits, frequent yawning. These are all signs that you may be drowsy while you're driving. Countermeasures, rolling down the window, loud music, caffeine, not so good, not really all that helpful. Best countermeasure, taking a nap. That's by far the best countermeasure for drowsy driving. So there's a huge body of literature about the effect of drowsiness in industrial accidents, and there's been a lot of different industrial accidents linked to massively sleep-deprived workers that were in critical decision-making capabilities. So an illustration of these is the 3 Mile power plant meltdown, Exxon Valdez oil spill, the nuclear meltdown in Chernobyl, Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. All of these disasters were in large part related to drowsy workers making decisions. So there are health consequences to sleep deprivation. So people that are sleep deprived have increased blood pressure, increased risk for heart attacks, stroke, increased risk for diabetes, increased risk for obesity, and also impaired immune system. So there's been a number of studies that have shown that if you get a vaccination when you're sleep deprived, you will have a decreased antibody response compared to if you were well rested when you got the vaccination. This was a study looking at the flu vaccination, but the same study has been done with hepatitis A vaccinations and other vaccinations. So when you get a vaccine, you're best off getting it while you're rested as compared with when you're sleep deprived, because your antibody response will be significantly less in a sleep deprived condition. Also, sleep deprivation increases the risk for colds, for flu, because it does have this immune suppressant effect. So there's also a link between sleep deprivation and obesity. So why is that? So sleep deprivation increases the hormones that regulate our appetite. These hormones are called leptin and ghrelin. So sleep deprivation increases appetite. Have you ever spent a couple late nights and developed the munchies? If so, that's probably because you've got these increased hormones that control appetite. So sleep deprivation leads to an increased opportunity to eat. Furthermore, sleep deprivation causes a decrease in body temperature, lowering our metabolism, and increased fatigue. This results in reduced energy expenditure, and the net result is an increase in obesity. Furthermore, sleep deprivation causes increase in cortisol levels in our body, and this also leads to increased fat deposition and weight gain. So there's been a number of studies that have looked at this. One study was looked at young, healthy, non-diabetic, thin young men, and they deprived these young men of 4 hours of sleep for they limited their sleep to 4 hours per night for 2 successive nights. What was found was that there was an increase in ghrelin level and a decrease in leptin levels. These are the appetite hormone regulators. This led to an increase in hunger by 24%, an increase in appetite by 23%, and furthermore, there was a craving for calorie-dense, high-carbohydrate foods. So this was an interesting study performed by Hassler, published in 2004. So what they looked at was a group of 27-year-olds, and they evaluated these 27-year-old people at baseline. They asked them, how much sleep do you get per night? How much sleep do you get per night? What is the duration of your sleep per night? Then they followed these 27-year-olds over the next 13 years until they reached age 40. And then they plotted their body mass index relative to the amount of sleep that they had at baseline. And you'll see that there's a linear relationship to the degree of sleep that they reported at baseline to their body mass index. So this is an illustration of the fact that sleep deprivation most likely leads to increased body weight over time. So if you want to lose weight, spend more time in bed. So the other interesting thing about sleep deprivation is it can cause or may lead to diabetes or an increased risk for diabetes. So these are studies that looked at partial sleep deprivation, again, in thin young males. And with 3 nights of partial sleep deprivation, there was decreased glucose tolerance and decreased insulin sensitivity. So in other words, 3 nights of partial sleep deprivation led to a pre-diabetic state in these healthy, thin, young, non-diabetic men. So even relatively short duration partial sleep deprivation can cause this pre-diabetic condition. So this was a study, this is the Nurses' Heart Health Study. This was a study of 70,000 women over a period of 10 years. So they asked women at the beginning of the study, how much sleep do you get? And then they tracked them over a 10-year period. And what they found was that 7 hours of sleep was sort of the magic number. That was where there was the lowest risk for developing diabetes. Women that had significantly less sleep than that or significantly more sleep than that had an increased risk for diabetes. So this was a similar study performed in men. This was a Massachusetts male aging study, over 1,000 men. They studied these men for between 5 and 7 years, and what they found was very similar to what was found in women, was that either too little sleep or too much sleep was associated with a significantly increased risk for developing diabetes. So there are other health consequences associated with sleep deprivation. As we mentioned, nervous system, memory, and learning are greatly affected or impaired by sleep deprivation. There's an increased risk for tremors, seizures, headaches, pain. Balance is affected, increased risk of falling. Mood is affected. People become moody and despondent when they're chronically sleep deprived. And there's actually studies that show that if you don't get enough sleep over time, you have an increased risk for mortality. So this was a study performed back in 1982. This is the cancer prevention study. This looked at 1.1 million people and followed these people over a course of 6 years. These people were aged 30 to 102 at baseline, and they followed these people over 6 years. So what they looked at was the self-reported amount of sleep they had at baseline, and then followed these people to determine if they died over the course of the next 6 years. And this is what they found, that the ideal amount of sleep to lower your risk for mortality is about 7 hours. If you achieve significantly less sleep than that or significantly more sleep than that, you had an increased risk of dying over this time frame. So this is another study. This was performed in British civil servants. These are all white-collar workers in England. And they followed these people, the first graph, they followed these people over 5 years. And then the second graph is the same group of people. And they, again, asked people at baseline, how much did you sleep? They asked them the same question here, how much do you sleep per night? And they followed these people. So this group was followed 5 years, and then they asked them again, and then they followed them an additional 12 years. So this is a 17-year study total. And what it illustrates is what we showed in the previous slide, is that there was an increased risk of mortality for those that slept significantly less than or greater than 7 hours a night. So it turns out that if you sleep significantly less than 7 hours a night, your risk for dying was of cardiovascular disease was greatly increased. So people that slept less than 5 hours a night typically die of heart attacks, strokes, cardiovascular disease. People that spend a lot more time in bed, like 9 or more hours, had increased risk of dying from non-cardiovascular causes, such as pneumonia, depression, cancer. So it is interesting. So you want to shoot for that 7 to 8 hours a night of sleep to lower your morbidity and mortality. So most frequent causes of daytime sleepiness. As we mentioned, insufficient sleep is probably the most common cause of daytime sleepiness, but various sleep disorders can also cause profound degrees of sleepiness during the day. The most common sleep disorder we see in the sleep center is obstructive sleep apnea. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So what does sleep apnea mean? Sleep apnea just means a cessation of breathing or diminished breathing despite effort to breathe. So what happens, as you'll see in this slide, when people with sleep apnea lie down to go to sleep, the back of their tongue falls back and it collapses their airway. So they're attempting to breathe against a closed airway. So we define sleep apnea as greater than 5 pauses in breathing or diminished breathing, greater than 5 episodes per hour of sleep. Moderate sleep apnea is 15 to 29, and severe sleep apnea is greater than 30 pauses in breathing per hour of sleep. Sleep apnea symptoms: snoring, awakening with gasping or choking, frequent urination throughout the night, and restless sleep. Daytime symptoms of sleep apnea, typically sleep apnea manifests as daytime sleepiness, tiredness, morning headaches, cognitive deficits, memory and intellectual impairment, personality and mood changes, sexual dysfunction, and gastroesophageal reflux. The predisposing factors for sleep apnea are, number one, obesity or being overweight. A neck size of greater than 17 inches in men, greater than 15 inches in women is strongly correlated with the development of sleep apnea. People tend to develop sleep apnea as they get older. It's much more common in middle-aged people or older people as compared to younger. Alcohol, sedative or tobacco use, hypothyroidism, and genetic factors. First-degree relatives of sleep apnea have a 2 to 4-fold increased risk for sleep apnea compared to those that do not have relatives with sleep apnea. So let me show you some sleep apnea in action. So this is what sleep apnea looks like in the sleep lab. Now you'll see a cessation of breathing here. What you'll see is that there will eventually be movement of the abdomen as he's attempting to try to breathe against a closed airway. And witness how long this apneic episode is occurring. So you'll see the movement of the abdomen, his chest goes sucked in and his abdomen expands as he's trying to breathe. And eventually he sort of gasps and his brain partially awakens as he finally takes a breath. So imagine sleeping next to this guy. Can you imagine that? You know, this guy's doing this all night long. So what is happening is that when he awakens, he gets a burst of adrenaline, and these adrenaline surges throughout the night lead to increased risk for high blood pressure, increased risk for heart attack, increased risk for stroke, increased risk for diabetes. So sleep apnea is not good. Avoid clock watching after going to bed. Limit bedroom activity to sleep and intimacy, and don't take work to bed with you because that tends to be activating. And also limit light exposure in the evening before you go to bed. You know, so light is activating. If you expose yourself to bright light in the evening, that decreases melatonin secretion. So you want to avoid bright light, especially an hour or so before bedtime. So what about naps? Geez, short nap is a wonderful thing. And NASA showed that a short nap improved pilots' performance by more than 35%. Caffeine, you know, the half-life of caffeine in most people is about 5 to 6 hours. So that means if you drink caffeine in the late afternoon, you're going to have caffeine in your bloodstream by the time you go to sleep. Caffeine works because it's an adenosine receptor blocker. It decreases the effective adenosine buildup in our brain. So caffeine is ubiquitous. You know, it's in a lot of things we don't even realize, like you know, things like anisin or Excedrin, extra strength. Look at Starbucks Grande, 550 milligrams of caffeine. That's a big slug of caffeine. So, you know, caffeine is a drug, so you want to use it like any other drug. You want to use it appropriately. Caffeine, people develop a tolerance to it. So you want to use it judiciously, and the best time to drink caffeine is in the late morning or early afternoon, because that's when we're starting to build up a little adenosine. We really have very little adenosine in our brain in the morning, so if you drink a big slug of caffeine in the morning, it doesn't really do as much for you as if you consume caffeine late morning, early afternoon. Alcohol is sedating. It will help people fall asleep, but it's metabolized very rapidly, and the net result is it causes frequent awakenings in the latter part of the night. And chronic alcohol use really disrupts sleep by decreasing deep sleep and also REM sleep. So sleep is the single most reliable human performance enhancer available to us, so use it wisely and professionally. With that, I'll conclude and open up to any questions, and I'll just put these facts up while we're answering questions. Anybody have a question? Yes? You know, you can have a little bit of caffeine. You know, a cup of coffee may have 100 milligrams of caffeine, so that's okay. You know, but I wouldn't drink. I wouldn't consume 550 milligrams of caffeine in the late afternoon, because that's probably going to affect your sleep at night. But 100 milligrams of caffeine, yeah, that's probably okay. You know. Oh, yeah, it's standard. You know, cup of coffee. Not the high-powered stuff, just a standard. You know. Tea is about 60 milligrams of caffeine, so that's even less. Yeah?
Do you have any idea what some like Ambien or any of these kind of medications, do they interfere with your ability to dream or to?
No.
No.
So, yeah, I've been involved in research involving all the sleep products currently on the market. So Ambien typically has a duration of action of about 4 hours. The regular release Ambien. So, you know, Ambien is pretty good to put people to sleep. It's not the greatest drug to keep people asleep throughout the night because of the relatively short half-life. But it is a fairly potent hypnotic. You know, in recent years, there's been a lot of reports about people doing strange things like sleep eating when they take Ambien. That doesn't occur a lot, but there are some people that are susceptible to this, so we don't recommend it for those people. But it is an effective hypnotic. It's best taken intermittently, because that way your body won't develop a tolerance to it. If you take it every single night, your body will develop some degree of tolerance. But taken intermittently, it's you know, it's a relatively safe hypnotic. In recent years, there's the recommendation for dosing has changed, so now we recommend 5 milligrams for most people to start with. The standard dose has been 10 milligrams, but there are some people that metabolize it slowly, and they can have a residual effect the next morning after taking Ambien. But yeah, there's a variety of different products that are very safe. There's some that are completely different than Ambien that are not habit-forming, not addictive. So if you've got chronic insomnia, usually there's some remedy that we can come up with that will be helpful. Yeah, question?
I had a question about sleep, like debt accumulation,
Mm-hmm.
about accumulating one's depth of sleep. How do we get back on the clock? We've only been getting 6 hours of sleep for months on end. Do we suddenly start doing 9, or we just start 7 to 8 and that's okay? And the second question is about wine with dinner. What sort of wine intake do you recommend? Do you prohibit? What do you recommend?
Well, wine, so alcohol is metabolized, to answer your second question first, alcohol is metabolized fairly quickly, usually within a couple hours. So if you have a glass or two of wine at dinner, that's okay, because it's probably going to be mostly metabolized by the time you go to bed at night, unless your dinner is very late. But yeah, the point is, if you drink alcohol shortly before bedtime, it's going to be metabolized, so it'll put you to sleep. But then the remainder of your night's going to be very disrupted. You'll have more frequent awakenings and disrupted sleep. To answer your question about sleep debt, so sleep debt, the only way you can discharge sleep debt is achieving an adequate amount of sleep. So there's a lot of people that deprive themselves of sleep Monday through Friday and catch up on the weekends. But really, you want to determine what is your optimal sleep time. Now, there are some people, probably less than 10% of the population, that can get by on consistently less than 6 hours of sleep per night. You know, and over, you know, there's been some famous people over time. For example, Donald Trump. You know, Jay Leno. geez, there's some other folks, these luminaries that are able to consistently get by in less than 5 hours a night. But they're the rarity. You know, Albert Einstein slept 9 to 10 hours every night. So, and it's really genetically predetermined. You can't really do anything if you're wired to need 7 hours a night and you're getting 5 hours a night, then you're going to be very, very impaired. So the only way to discharge the sleep debt is to achieve an adequate amount of sleep. So you can, you know, catch up on weekends or vacations, but yeah, the goal should be to try to achieve an adequate amount of sleep on most nights. Is there another question? Yeah, over here.
Do melatonin levels that are cyclical over a 24-hour period remain pretty much the same even if you stay awake?
No. So yeah, if you stay awake for 24 hours, you'll still have a surge of melatonin around your normal bedtime, an hour before your normal bedtime, and then you'll see a dissipation of melatonin during the normal daylight hours. So yeah, right now we have almost no melatonin in our bloodstream. But if your normal bedtime is 11 o'clock, you'll see a big surge of melatonin starting around 10, and that will remain elevated throughout the night.
Even if you stay awake?
Even if you stay awake. Yes?
On the sleep apnea, you showed the gentleman sleeping and struggling to breathe. He was on his back. Does it matter how you, like, if he rolled over or put a pillow behind his head? Does that make any difference?
Sometimes it makes a big difference. Yeah, there are people that have positional sleep apnea where the sleep apnea is almost exclusively in the supine position relative to the lateral position. But a lot of folks that especially have bad sleep apnea have sleep apnea in all positions, you know. So I think this guy, I'm sure he's got bad sleep apnea on his side as well as on his back. But yeah, to your point, there are some people with mild to moderate sleep apnea where that's an effective treatment. If they maintain sleeping on one side or the other, that sometimes is reasonable treatment for sleep apnea. Yes? Yeah. So it turns out, yeah, that shortly before we go to bed, our body temperature starts falling. And the falling body temperature actually facilitates our ability to fall asleep. So if you're in a hot environment, that may be counterproductive to sleep. So it's the fall in body temperature that actually helps allow people to fall asleep. So you probably heard the old saying, the old wives' tale about, you know, if you take a hot shower or bath before bedtime, that helps. Well, that's actually true because if you take a hot bath or shower, that increases your body temperature, and then as you're cooling off, that facilitates sleep. It makes you drowsy, helps you fall asleep. So yeah, the bedroom in general should be relatively cool, and especially as you're trying to fall asleep at the beginning of the night. Yes?
I've heard that the first 40 to 45 minutes, like when you're trying to go to sleep, is the best time. I know sometimes when I sleep, if I pass that amount, then I'm like wide awake.
Mm.
You have not addressed it at all today, so I didn't know if that's a fallacy or if it's true.
Yeah, so so we get most of our deep sleep in the very beginning of the night. So that's what's happening. When you fall asleep, you rapidly descend into deep sleep. And yeah, some people, you know, they wake up when they hit the first REM episode after about 90 minutes. And yeah, so you know, there's different types of insomnia, you know. So some people have insomnia where they have difficulty falling asleep at the beginning of the night. Other people have frequent awakenings throughout the night. And different types of insomnia typically have different treatment approaches. So if somebody only has trouble falling asleep at the beginning of the night, there are different medications we use as compared to those people that have frequent awakenings throughout the night, or those people that wake up at 4 in the morning and can't get back to sleep. So yeah, the treatment for insomnia depends on the particular type of insomnia that somebody has. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned about like the light being activating a factor, and I've heard a lot about like you shouldn't watch TV like an hour before you go to bed because of that spike in melatonin and that like you're trying to like wind down. Is that something you recommend? And then also like in the morning, I've seen these like products or whatever, right, that like show like the light comes on like gradually in your room to like help you wake up. Is that of any use, or is that just like a marketing thing?
Yeah, there's this whole something called chronotherapy, which means appropriate timed use of light. Light in the morning is very good, you know. So this is we actually prescribe light boxes for certain sleep problems, but especially, you know, in the middle of the winter, you know, a lot of people have this seasonal affective disorder. So exposure to bright light in the morning is very good. It helps lift mood. It helps reinforce our circadian rhythm. It may facilitate sleep. And light exposure at night is not good because it suppresses melatonin. I'm talking about shortly before bedtime. Bright light exposure shortly before bedtime is bad because it's activating, it suppresses melatonin level, and it actually can interfere with people's ability to fall asleep. So if you take your computer with you to bed and you're looking at a bright computer screen, you know, that's counterproductive to being able to fall asleep. It may prolong your ability to fall asleep. So in kids, we see this in teenagers, you know, in high school and college. They often develop, or sometimes can develop, what's called delayed sleep phase syndrome, where, you know, they'll stay up on the weekends till, you know, 3 or 4 in the morning, and then, you know, on Monday they have to wake up at 8 in the morning to go to class. And what they've done is they've reset their clock in their brain, so they have great difficulty falling asleep at a normal bedtime, and they don't get sleepy until 3 or 4 in the morning. So in order to reset their clock, we use timed light therapy. So exposure to bright light in the morning helps reset their clock. Elderly people have something called advanced sleep phase syndrome. So in some elderly people, they get very drowsy at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and then they wake up at 3 in the morning and they can't get back to sleep. So in these people, we use bright light in the evening because that pushes their clock back and allows them to fall asleep at a more reasonable time, like 10 or 11 o'clock. So yeah, timed bright light therapy is very important for setting our circadian clock. So yeah, to your point, yeah, it's best to avoid bright light shortly before bedtime. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.